Bueno, buenas tardes. Estamos en la última sesión del Seminario de Algoritmos y Periodismo del Centro de Investigación sobre Industrias Culturales y Espacio Público de la Universidad Nacional de Quilmes. Fueron dos jornadas muy productivas, con mesas académicas, con invitados e invitadas de la industria, del mundo del trabajo, con colegas que han reflexionado sobre justamente la participación, la intervención de las plataformas digitales en el ecosistema de producción, circulación social de información, de entretenimiento, de la conversación pública. Y en esta última sesión vamos a escuchar una conferencia que fue especialmente grabada para este seminario por parte de Menno. Él es jefe del sector de asuntos globales de servicios digitales y plataformas de la Dirección General de Redes de Comunicación, Contenido y Tecnología de la Comisión Europea, gestión que ha realizado nuestra colega, la investigadora Ana Becerra. Así que sin más, pueden leer la traducción de la intervención de Cox en castellano, en una traducción que hizo Ana Becerra, que está en el sitio web www.centroicep.com. Y sin más, entonces vamos a transmitir la conferencia sobre la ley de servicios digitales y sobre la ley de mercados digitales, que, como explicaba antes Ángel García Castillejo, son más que leyes, reglamentos generales que adoptó Europa sobre las grandes plataformas digitales. Allá vamos.
Of course, and I'm here today to present to you the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, the EU's landmark digital regulations that have very recently been adopted and are about to enter into force. This event couldn't come at a more timely moment, because not only will these landmark regulations for all of our digital services enter into force soon and see the EU experiment first with these platform rules and transparency, algorithmic transparency rules globally, but they also come at a pivotal moment in time for the global internet and access to information that it facilitates. Of course, I'll give in a bit more background in a moment, but let's first talk about the idea of platform regulation. Platform is a generic term, but in this case refers to a new type of digital service that has emerged over decades and has grown into something that is very prevalent in our daily lives and economies, and intermediates all interactions we have in our daily lives, because it really extends from identification and authentication to making payments, to indeed engaging with our friends and family on messenger services, and even engaging in formal job interviews and the like, that you can seamlessly organize through certain social media platforms that integrate with messenger services, that integrate with collaborative services, and even video conferencing services, as the one I'm using right now. So this is a bit of a background around the term of platform. It's a very specific type of service that today has tremendous influence on our lives, and a positive one, I would say. And then at the same time, we need to recognize that this tremendous access to information that platforms offer comes with important challenges. But it's too simple to say we're only talking about opportunities and challenges here, and we now need to regulate as governments just to guard against the challenges. It really is actually a way of maturing this whole move that we are making online, and simply translating our offline values to the online world. And so today, we'll be talking about indeed how do we keep our citizens safe while acting online and making use of the incredible opportunities that digital offers for our citizens, and how do we, in a way, use our economies to help make that happen in the in a way that it actually improves the situation that we know offline and that we know online today. How do we change the status quo and make it that we can enhance all human rights that we enjoy online in a not only safe but also very pleasant and empowering circumstance? So that's the question that I will try to answer by explaining what these two regulations that I'm talking about today mean and how they translate certain values that I also believe are universal. But this brings me back to why I believe today comes at a very pivotal moment in time. Uh, this is not only because there's two regulations entering into force, of course. You need to see um, at what the world looks like today. And one event that took place just a couple of weeks ago is that um, the incredible uprising or protests we are seeing across the Iranian Republic um, have led to a reaction by um, governments around the world, but notably by the United States, to relax their sanctions regime and allow the continued export of specifically online platform and digital services. They indeed feature front and center. So you're really, when you look at the new license of the US Treasury, you can really find exactly those services that I will be talking about today mentioned in the first line. It's social media services, video conferencing services, cloud services, and all related services that power this online platform economy. And the license actually also explains something that's crucial, namely that these services, if properly managed, and that's what we aim to do, can give citizens agency. And that's in the end what we all strive for and what I think is a universal principle. That's not something specific to the EU. It's actually a global interest and movement that we want to use the internet and the tool that it is uh, to enhance our agency as citizens and our involvement in public debate and our ability to shape our lives. So, with that, I'll move to the first slide of this presentation, which translates what I believe are those universal values that the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act simply translate into law. And this is important, the fact that these are universal values, because Argentina, for instance, is also a partner in the so-called Declaration for the Future of the Internet, which is precisely a document that tries to translate or establish a vision for the Internet that is open, free, interoperable, and human rights respecting, or rather enhancing, as I said, for all. And these are indeed universal values. That's the way the internet has evolved and come to facilitate our lives. So, with that in mind, let's have a look at the purpose and principles also of the two acts that I'm talking about today that are specific to the European Union. So, the first is that you want to stop viewing the safety of citizens and freedom of expression as a trade off. You actually want to make sure that online we can all be safe in a very rich town square. And indeed, when you think about the risks you face online and the way they can be managed, if they're managed well and transparently and by citizens, partly by citizens themselves, then in the end, you could say there is more freedom of expression because online discoverability is key. And in a safe and well managed town square, there is more legitimate free speech. Um, and then this is coupled in the EU approach, this fundamental universal principle with the idea that in order to give citizens agency and to also allow innovation and freedom and plurality of views, you need to also leverage the citizens in their capability of innovators in this space. So the other side of the coin, which is on the one hand the Digital Services Act, which covers the topic of illegal content online and societal harms. So truly, where there are society-wide risks that flow from the use of online platforms. The other side of the coin is the Digital Markets Act, which really talks about contestability and fairness, so that's not an objective in itself, but that is in order to maintain that crucial innovation, long-term innovation around the large ecosystem platforms that we have seen emerge, so that on top of these infrastructures, there is a wide variety of offers that citizens can then freely choose from and well informed also, so that they can choose which services align with their values and that are um, keeping their marketplaces safe, but also have an empowering vision that fits with their view of the world. And in the end, all that to lead to a system where you can prevent that as a government you need to engage in strict content moderation, which first of all is something very difficult to do in a way that is not um, conflictual with the protection of freedom of expression, because it would have to be a very crude stick that you wield as a government. Um, and that also, in a way, is manageable and respecting the role that the citizens play here. So having these fundamental principles in mind, I just set out what the regulatory landscape for online platforms in the European Union will look like. Um, Today, there is already a regulation in place which covers online platforms, which is the Platform to Business Regulation. Um, and this is actually something that has been in place since July 2020. It will remain in force and it covers the over 10,000 online platforms that are active in the EU and provides a base layer of transparency. That's already a very important step because it actually informs citizens, for instance, about the main parameters that determine ranking, so visibility online, so that when you engage with such a service, you know how services are ranked for you in general search, but also in software application stores and all the other intermediaries that are most important for us to find important services that we use on a day-to-day basis. So you can really find out in that limited space available to give prominence to certain services, what are the main parameters out of potentially hundreds of thousands. So you really understand how this is being presented to you and what you perhaps should be looking for based on your own informed opinion. So this is in a way a first algorithmic transparency rule that already applies today, and it'll grow even in importance as this online economy again grows in importance as well. And that will then be coupled with two acts that have a slightly different scope and approach, and that's the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, where the Digital Services Act applies to all intermediaries. And has a proportionate approach. So it applies more obligations to the largest players, and that reflects the fact that the largest players carry the largest societal risks that you need to mitigate against. But I'll get to that in a second. And the Digital Markets Act is that other side of the coin that secures contestability and the ability to build on top of the existing ecosystems or gatekeepers, and that applies only to a subset of the very largest gatekeepers, those in the European Union that have at least 45 million end users on one side, 10,000 business users on the other side, and that are operated by a company that has at least 7.5 billion euro turnover in the EU, or a huge market capitalization, 75 billion euros or more. Now, I present, of course, now the regulatory landscape for platforms, and you see that the fundamental principles behind them are reflected below: transparency, safety, and fairness. But if we look at the wider landscape, it's very important as a fundamental universal principle of platform regulation that regulation in itself doesn't cut it. what you need to appropriately regulate online content is a whole of society approach that involves all actors, citizens at the center, but journalists, um, trusted flaggers, fact checkers, civil society organizations, um, and government in a very holistic approach. So in this slide, what I've tried to illustrate is that the three acts are at the center, the P2B, DSA, and DMA acts, because they are horizontal, they cut across different sectors and industries, but they're of course one piece of a puzzle, and all of these layers, all of these pieces need to be in place. So you see here that in the circles we talk about regulation, and one important piece of the puzzle is something the European Union has recently proposed. It's a Media Freedom Act to make sure also in Europe media is truly free to indeed improve freedom of expression and give citizens access to reliable information. But there's also in the squares more voluntary efforts or funding programs. And one important aspect there is the Code of Practice Against Disinformation, which will have an important link to the Regulatory Digital Services Act, because companies can sign up to this voluntary code that has been negotiated over a long time, and through many iterations has improved and has important commitments in it. You can use that as a risk mitigation measure if you identify as a platform that disinformation is indeed a crucial risk on your platform. So just to keep in mind that this whole of society approach is crucial, and it goes much beyond this slide. It also relates to funding for quality journalism, digital skills education, and in all of those areas, all of us around the world are of course active, and we also know from our own development aid programs that these are priorities to help capacity building in certain nations that need it, and others are already doing that, and there's global coalitions arising around the need for these efforts, so that as a global community we are resilient, and we truly as citizens, global citizens, have agency and can shape the online environment um, after our own in our own human-centric way. So very quickly on where we are at the moment in the European Union regarding this Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. You see that from December 2020, when these ideas were proposed, we have moved quite fast now to the fall of 2022, as these two acts they went through Parliament, if you will, European Parliament and the Council, and they're about to enter into force. And that will happen in October for one and November for the other, most likely. And that follows the publication in the European Union official journal. And on the right bottom of the slide, I have indicated a tentative moment for when their obligations for the very large players that they cover, social media, search engines, and the others, um, could first start to apply, because there is a process of designation of the specific services that needs to kick in. Then there is a certain period during which those services need to implement the obligations. So we're talking about the third quarter of 23 for one and the first quarter of 2024 for the other, that the obligations will actually kick in. But that means that between now and then, all of the preparatory work, all of the implementation dialogue with these players, all of the engineering decisions will have to be taken and implemented. And we will see an important change and gain crucial experience that I feel is also important to engage with other authorities around the world on, that are considering similar regulations as part of that, what, as I mentioned, whole of society approach. Um, Very quickly then, because I know time is short and I am very grateful for the opportunity and I would like to be invited again. It's hard to keep it short because these are very holistic regulations with many, many articles, but to go down to the core of the Digital Services Act in the first place and then the Digital Markets Act after this, one thing that's crucial, first of all, is that the Digital Services Act, while it deals with illegal content online and societal harms, it does not define what is a piece of illegal content, nor does it define specifically what is a societal harm that you need to identify and immediately remove from your platform. It actually introduces these two notions differently. For illegality, first of all, it establishes simply procedures with checks and balances and oversight by citizens, by independent dispute settlement organizations, and by auditors to make sure that we rely on what is illegal offline um, without inventing a new generic category of illegality online that would actually inherently lead to over removal of legitimate content, which is so difficult to um, put in a specific category. So this is really about relying on constitutional traditions, separation of powers, and legal certainty around what is illegal. So no generic clauses, but specific notions of, for instance, illegal gender-based violence that could have very specific definitions and on which the EU is also progressing even at European level. That could then be the basis. So in another law, that could then trigger procedures under the Digital Services Act to remove specific items of content. That's a crucial part. And the other is that the Digital Services Act will remove a certain disincentive that platforms have today for taking voluntary action. And that's that it explains that voluntary own initiative targeted investigations into illegality doesn't mean that you no longer benefit from your shield of liability as an intermediary for user generated content. And I think that notion of an intermediary liability shield may ring familiar to many of you. And that is, of course, something that the DSA, the Digital Services Act, also retains, because the DSA updates the existing law in the European Union that contains this intermediary liability shield. So that's the first key principle. It doesn't define what is illegal, but it establishes clear and transparent procedures for dealing with illegality online. Then the second crucial principle of the Digital Services Act is that it applies a whole host of standalone obligations so that the liability shield isn't dependent on complying with these obligations, but you can be significantly fined or face even further measures if you don't comply with these self-standing obligations. But it applies those obligations in an asymmetric manner. So the largest services that pose the largest societal risk, they bear the heaviest obligations. But at the same time, the DSA applies to the whole internet stack, so it doesn't leave certain more infrastructural players out of scope. You can see that also internet access providers and domain name registries are considered intermediaries and have to make sure that, for instance, their terms and conditions are transparently available and comply with a fundamental rights check. So the whole stack is covered, but we focus on where content moderation should happen, namely on the layer where citizens have transparency and can act themselves, and where individual pieces of content can be removed if really necessary, instead of what you sometimes see are targeted internet shutdowns where an entire service like a social media network is removed by a cloud provider, which inherently reduces freedom of expression instead of enhancing it. Here you have an overall snapshot of the obligations in the Digital Services Act, and you will see that indeed the largest players, the very large platforms on the left, they face the whole gamut of obligations, whereas intermediaries have only the basic obligations of the Digital Services Act, reflecting that risk-based approach. And that brings me to the third principle, that all of these cumulative obligations are subject to a very strong oversight and auditing obligation, which means that indeed a platform has to, subject to government oversight, report on how it's complying with these obligations and submit it to an independent audit. The auditor is again verified for independence by the government, but the government itself isn't the auditor. This has to be an independent report, which is then also made public, so that again, also our society can understand what's happening, what the risks are that they face, and what the measures are that they take against it. And this whole approach with identifying the major risks that apply only for the largest platforms and then mitigating against it, it also has a fundamental principle behind it, namely that you cannot expect services to get it right in 100% of the cases without losing this fundamental role that they play in enhancing freedom of expression. So a risk-based approach, including on human rights compliance, freedom of expression, freedom to conduct a business, and safety, all of those rights need to be risk assessed and then the best mitigating measures applied, but only where proportionate and necessary. So this is really not about a system where you focus only on one side of the coin, which is safety, while losing in a disproportionate manner all of the other important acquired rights. So their public oversight is that third fundamental principle underlying the Digital Services Act. And I just wanted to show you this slide as the last one on the Digital Services Act, which explains that idea that you can have more safety and more freedom of expression. And you also see that when you look at the various articles of the Digital Services Act in more detail, you can see that every time, and so both sides here serve both purposes, safety and freedom of expression. You can see that when a statement of reasons needs to be given so that as a user I can contest whenever my content is removed, the law sets certain standards for what details such a statement needs to contain so that I can be sure that I know why content was removed and how I can remedy that situation. You then see again in bold Article 21 on the left that a dispute settlement body needs to be certified by government around independence and other standards that are transparently set out in law. And there is then the requirement for public reports issued on their activities so that we move away from that situation where there is some half-baked attempts by private firms to set up half-independent bodies that will always suffer from a lack of legitimacy precisely because of the lack of verified independence and oversight. But again, it is then outside of government, but verified by government and the public. So every time in bold, you will see that there is that involvement of civil society and basically the triggering of their involvement so that it isn't government that is moderating speech, but it is citizens that have agency. So there comes that principle that I mentioned at the beginning. Citizen agency over platforms to surface quality content is the underlying objective and what I think is a universal principle behind keeping citizens safe online. Then I would move to the Digital Markets Act with your permission, which is the other side of the coin, but an equally important side of the coin, because the system wouldn't work without having innovation and contestability around what are incredibly concentrated ecosystems of online platforms that we see today. So here, again, as I mentioned, you want to be able to leverage a rich pipeline of platforms so that there is also competition on values. Privacy is, for instance, these days a competition parameter, a very important one, in addition to price, and so are values. Privacy being one, but many others also coming into play. And if there is more transparency around terms and conditions and their fundamental rights compliance and about the societal harms that certain platforms pose, there's also more competition around the mitigating measures they take and also more information around how citizens can deal with these platforms and, for instance, with the opportunities that now the Digital Markets Act is supposed to offer. So what does it do? The Digital Markets Act, as I mentioned, focuses on a very limited number of platforms. We've seen that around certain core services, and I would identify here a few of them, like online search engines, online social media, or software application stores. they become such important gateways for citizens to reach services. Like my crucial banking app, I find in the software application store. And that means that they have an ability to leverage that core into all kinds of adjacent areas and create a mutually reinforcing bottleneck. And if that bottleneck is absolute, then there can't be any innovation neither on the core nor on the ancillary services. So the idea is you need to focus on that core, and then, as you see in the third bullet, apply some very clear do's and don'ts that apply in all cases. So there's no discussions around competition issues like market definition and how does online compete with offline. It's clear these are crucial bottlenecks for how we find our services and even our democratically important tools like authentication and identification, so that with those do's and don'ts that apply in all cases, we are guaranteed to be able to choose from a fair and rich offer. And those do's and don'ts are focused on two elements, I would say: vertical interoperability and fairness. And this is important because the digital market act is not about punishing success. We as citizens also want to use very well designed, seamless platform services that allow us to find things in a handy way in a central location and appropriately ranked. But we want to be able to know about how the ranking is done, and we want to know that other services can be present in such gateway services on equal footing and being able to offer the same, for instance, functionalities of let's say of a mobile phone that has a certain wireless payment option or wireless identification complementary to existing competition rules that gatekeepers shall also still comply with. Now, to visualize that, what I've just described with many words, it's a very hard thing to visualize, but if you think of these ecosystems built around core platform services, I give you the example here on the slide on the left. You could think that the core platform service would be an online search engine, which then in the EU meets those user numbers for it to be specifically designated. But it's already, for instance, expanded to related services like payment, like identification, but also to other core platform services like operating systems, virtual assistants, and all of that is mutually reinforcing. And what the DMA does is by applying to this first core platform service and maybe to some others, it explains that you cannot share data between those services without asking the user for its explicit consent upon use of each of the services, and not in a way that is, of course, going to um, tire out the user with endless consent requests. No, it needs to be informed consent, and you can only trigger it once annually, so that this doesn't become some sort of dark pattern that prevents all of us from actually using this choice. So it's really about recognizing that platforms inherently lead to efficiencies and network effects, and leaving that in place because that is actually an opportunity that it offers, and we would all like to use the important access to information and seamlessness that these services offer, but to allow them to be contested on the core and to be built on top of the core, and leverage the market in that sense. So that's the visualization. And here you see also a grouping of then what are those do's and don'ts to make this happen. And it's very important to see this in one slide, in my view, because the idea is that we don't implement a single provision and think that that will solve everything. It's really a cumulative effect. So you have to think of all of these applying at the same time to a single core platform service, but also to all other designated core platform services within a single umbrella organization. And then you can start to imagine what the major impact could be, that there is a combination of the side loading of software applications on mobile phones, together with the ability to use the NFC antenna, the wireless antenna, on an equal footing with the gatekeeper, combined with interoperability for messenger services, for instance. And so all of this comes as a cumulative effect and should make a marked difference to the status quo, which actually in our research showed risks even mid to long term innovation as such when we are as a society and economy moving fully online, and that trend is going to accelerate. And we shouldn't be naive about it. We should embrace it, but also help our citizens and businesses shape it. And I think that's the red thread throughout this presentation, that we should identify universal global principles that we all adhere to, and the overarching idea being that we want to shape our online environment so that we all can reap the benefits and have an incentive in maintaining that open and global and interoperable internet that I mentioned at the start, that is so crucial for our progress, but is now also critically under pressure as we see on a day-to-day basis. So I thank you for your attention, and I wish you a fantastic rest of the conference.